You're listening to a new episode of The Brave Technologist. This one features Kapil Gupta. Kapil works for the Cigna Group as a senior director on their generative AI project. Kapil specializes in leveraging emerging technologies to solve complex business problems at scale and is driven by a focus on crafting AI-driven product experiences that ensure high adoption. He balances a high-level strategic vision with a passion for staying hands-on, often vibe coding prototypes to prove out new concepts. In this episode, we discussed how generative AI differs from agentic AI, the power of questioning and probing AI outputs, the ways enterprise AI can integrate with existing workflows to drive adoption without disrupting users, and what the future of AI looks like, from invisible software to personal assistants that feel like magic. And now for this week's episode of The Brave Technologist. Kapil, welcome to The Brave Technologist. How are you doing?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate you coming on. I'm excited for this one. So you were on stage at the AI Summit. What did you hope listeners would leave feeling or thinking about everything?
I'll talk about two different aspects. I think we had a really good audience. They were very appreciative. We got pretty full room there. I'll talk about the enterprise perspective and perhaps the user perspective.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of discussion about the wonderful things that Gen AI can do. We see it in our daily lives. We experience it at work. There's obviously a lot of talk about it here at the summit. I think one thing that I hope people took away from that is that while there's a lot of promise and a lot of great things we can do with Gen AI, for us to be able to trust it, you have to have the right types of governance around it and to make sure it works properly in an enterprise context. I will say from a user perspective, hopefully users, folks in the room came away with a feeling that while there's a lot of discussion about, again, what AI can do, and there's, from a user perspective, there's almost perhaps a sense that AI is something that gets done or gets used and, it happens to me. But right. I think from a user perspective, there's, I think, a lot of opportunity for users to make their own choices about how they use AI and when to trust it and kind of use it in ways that make the most sense for themselves.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think those are good points too, especially when the trust. Really, there is a lot of kind of hype and a lot of magical thinking. The trust is super important. Your talk explored the partnership between agentic and generative AI. From the perspective of an everyday user, what does that partnership actually unlock?
So, generative AI is very good at cognitive tasks, right? Tasks which involve things like drafting a document, summarizing something, and so on. And from a user perspective, while that's very useful, it's sometimes hard to get a tangible sense for what the value was. Just to save time from doing it. But in contrast with agentic AI, which is focused on workflows and tasks and outcomes, for a user, that's much more tangible because the agent did something for you. They both provide values, but the agents provide a lot more tangible value for users to feel like, oh, it did this task or set of tasks for me. And even better if the agents can do things that the user doesn't like doing.
Right? Awesome. What are one of the biggest misconceptions around?
I would say that a lot of people sometimes just assume that when they ask a question and they get it back and it looks right, that it must be right. And it might even actually be right. I'm not talking about the verification part of it, but there's an element of, the way you use generative AI, which is very interesting, which is you can actually have, in a sense, you can push back. You can challenge. You can question. And so I think a lot of users don't realize until maybe they stumble on it or until somebody tells them that you can actually push back, and even though it looks right, say, but no, that's not what I meant. Or I get it, but something, right? And very often you end up unlocking much more value from questioning and probing and challenging the AI than if you just took the answer because it seemed right.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I think it's like one of those real hacks with figuring out prompting is that you kind of like shape the dialogue,
right.
And get the answer you're kind of looking for, by pushing back a little bit.
Correct. And the first answer might have been quote unquote correct. It's not that, it's not always, obviously if it's wrong, then you definitely want to push back. But even when the answer is quote-unquote correct, but it's not fully aligned with the context in which you are trying to use generative AI.
Yeah. No, that's a great point
You
too.
can kind of, there's nuance and where you can kind of shape the conversation and drive it in a certain way.
That's totally right on. Yeah, I mean, so you've got to spend 2 decades really like turning cutting edge tech into products that real people can use. What's the moment you realized AI is kind of ready for scale inside a large enterprise?
So if we talk about AI at scale, so I'll talk about actually 2 moments. One really from a technology perspective, again, one from a user perspective. From a technology perspective, this actually dates back to something 10 years ago. So it was perhaps in the earlier days of machine learning, and I was at JP Morgan Chase at the time. We'd had a leader recently come over from another organization, another financial services firm, and he was talking about using machine learning models at the time, which is effectively still AI. It's not generative AI, it's not agentic, but it's still AI. I'm talking about using AI models to try and match marketing offers to customers. And it was describing how they were doing it, or at least what the problem space was like. And what he described was essentially they were looking at, in that particular instance, 2,000 attributes for every type of customer. What type of preferences the person has, where do they like to travel, what kind of things they like to buy. So really detailed customer profiles with up to 2,000 attributes, but doing this for 20 to 30 million customers.
Wow.
So, back then, like say 10 years ago, if I was thinking of that as a database and thinking about, what the size is, the database, by then we already had large databases, so the size of that wasn't striking. But the aspect of having models which would try to assimilate the full set of data and extrapolate from that some types of, predictions that they could use to target orders. For me, that was the part that surprised me, because even before then, we've had probably 15, 20 years, very, very large databases for a long time. But usually in those databases, you're going into it and looking for a piece of data and extracting it, or looking across multiple datas, joining them, pulling out a specific piece of insight. This was an element of looking at a large data set in total and as a whole and drawing insights out of that. So for me, from a technology perspective, it was my first thought of like, wow, we are now at a point where we can operate on those sets of data as a whole at scale. I will say though, at a human level, there was even earlier this year at Cigna, we were building a custom internal chat assistant. And I was talking to users as we were kind of building it and refining it. And there was a user who said that, at the time, we were allowing users to export the responses as CSV, separated files, but not as Excel. And so the user had been trying to ask the assistant, I need an export in Excel. And the assistant said, I can't do Excel, but I can give you a CSV, and you can take that and put it into a file. For me, it unlocked that aspect of the technology being able to act in unexpected ways within certain approved norms, and kind of extrapolate that out into a scale. It gave me a sense that yes, we can actually put this out in front of a larger set of users in the enterprise and know that it'll act in ways that are still safe and kind of controlled.
And it kind of gave them a solution, right?
Yeah,
Which is really
exactly.
interesting. That's a really interesting example. If you could set kind of a new benchmark for what makes an enterprise AI product truly great, what features or values would you prioritize?
So I guess for me, it comes down to a few things. The first, I guess, I would say is that I love to build products where we've kind of masked the complexity, where the way it works is kind of hidden under the covers, and so for a user, it feels like, oh, this is like magic, right? Yeah. I think there's another aspect from enterprise perspective that becomes really important, which is to listen to users very carefully when we're building these products, because users will often describe a solution instead of a problem. They'll tell you, I want it to work this way, and very often the underlying problem is something different. And so you have to probe a little bit to make sure that you've understood the core underlying need and kind of make sure you kind of solve for that. And I guess to me, those are the elements that kind of really come to mind when you're driving, because they both involve really listening very carefully to users as well as paying a lot of attention to exactly what you're trying to build and doing it in a way that surprises the users and kind of helps them in the end, achieve what they want to do.
Yeah, and they're the ones using it, right? Like, I think that gets lost a lot, where, especially with AI, where there's such a top-down mandate to put it in all these things, but not enough people are actually kind of talking to the user to find that market fit, right? They can't find out, okay, here's how I'm actually going to use the thing, and it's such a good point that you touched on. So I think you've seen firsthand how enterprises kind of balance innovation and compliance, right? Obviously, it's got to be top of mind. What's a strategy or mindset that helps teams move quickly without introducing unnecessary risk?
So there's a couple of ways that I've seen, many of the companies I've worked at, even at Cigna and other places. One is to have typically what they call a sort of internal lab, right? Where you can do experimentation in a controlled environment, gives you a chance to kind of push the envelope, look for, emerging technologies. Sometimes when you're doing that experimentation, you don't quite know how it's going to work, whether it's going to work in a controlled fashion, whether it's going to meet your needs. So I think there's an element of having the type of controlled lab environment. I think the other element of this is to, again, involve users as much as you can. I think the second thing I'm going to mention doesn't always work in every company. Depends on the kind of employee, depends on the kind of business you have, types of employees, the kind of work they do. But one other aspect that's been very interesting that I've observed is the ability to set up, let's say, a program where you can provide early access of experimental tools to users and employees who have, let's say, a different threshold for, for the kind of support they're going to get, or for the stability of the software, right? Because within large enterprises, you'll always have, typically, I would say, a large segment of employees who aren't necessarily ready for software that isn't working right. And they need to work in a certain way, and they need to function every day because they need to get their jobs done on a certain schedule. But you do have often a smaller portion maybe of your employees who are able to deal with experimental software, and that gives you a chance and a mechanism to kind of roll out, let's say, beta software.
A lead user-based kind of.
Correct. And in terms of balancing it out with governance, right? I think the more that we can bake governance into the products that are built through some types of workflows and engines that check for certain types of rules, compliance, almost the notion of what they call governance as code. Those are elements that kind of help you navigate how to build and deploy technologies in a sort of safe and controlled way.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. What are some of the biggest challenges that organizations face when integrating generative and agentic AI?
So I think a common problem that I've seen again and again, certainly in large enterprises, has been, one is the aspect of legacy systems that aren't ready for use with, they don't have interfaces or mechanisms to interact with them very easily. I think the other element that tends to be very prevalent, especially in large enterprises, is disconnected data. And you have data that's sitting in different systems all across the enterprise. They don't really have a mechanism to talk to each other, or for you to reconcile the data and kind of make it into, convert it into a single layer. And what happens is that Gen AI is moving so fast. And for a lot of companies that, or especially leaders, to hear about it and tell their teams, we got to jump on this, we got to do it right now, we got to find out how to embed Gen AI in our products. The intent is, I think, is good, and I think it's right. But I think the reality is that for you to be able to leverage Gen AI, you almost need to have, as a prerequisite, data and systems that talk to each other, so that you can layer Gen AI on top of that. And I think a lot of companies find out that when they go to implement their Gen AI and agentic systems, that before they can start doing that, they have to then go in and invest some more effort in kind of bringing these two together in ways that you can actually use it.
Cleaning up technical debt and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's interesting. Like getting a big company to adopt a new platform is sometimes harder than building a platform itself, right? What do you find most effective in driving adoption in a large enterprise?
So I would say the thing I've experienced a lot are a couple of things. One is, and I've told all my team, whenever I'm working with my team to build a new platform or to replace something, I tell them a couple of things. One is that it's really important for us to try and build platforms that integrate or complement users' existing workflows.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is if the employee or the user has a certain way of doing their job today and it involves doing tasks in a certain order, A, B, C, and you tell them that I'm building this new platform, but what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to change the order in which you do things because the platform is built to do things differently.
Yeah.
The challenge becomes then you're putting the onus on them
Right.
to make that shift.
Yeah.
And so it becomes really important to build out the workflows of the platform so that they actually complement the way in which those users work today.
Yeah.
And so for them, the bar is lower, right? They still work the way they do today, but they're able to leverage the technology and they just have to it helps them kind of get their work done.
Yeah.
I think the second thing that I emphasize a lot is that back, especially in this context when you're trying to make users change their behavior, that if you're asking them to do something different from the way they do today, it becomes really important to offer them, in terms of value, something that they don't have today,
Right.
or something that addresses a pain point that they have today.
Yeah.
Because for a user, it's very hard to incentivize a user and tell them, I have a new tool or a new platform, but it's going to do exactly the same things the old tool did.
Right.
Right? And it might be a new stack, it might be, latest technology, but from a user perspective, they're going to look at it and say, I know this is fancier and looks prettier, but if it's doing the same thing, I'd much rather just keep doing what I'm doing now. I don't want to have to learn. Why should I bother? And so you have to offer them something of value that's not just that it's new and that it's shinier, but in the old system, you had this problem or you had this point in which you had to do certain things yourself.
Yeah.
And that gets solved here.
I can save you this much
You have
time.
you have to offer them something of value so they feel that the shift is worth it.
Totally.
For them to learn and take the effort to move to a new platform.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, I think there's also kind of this race to innovate, that's happening right now. What conversation are we not having in that book in the program?
So I would say in the context of Gen AI, there's a lot of talk about, we touched on it earlier, about trust and verification, validation. Everywhere you go, there's a lot of talk about evals and how you use evals to ensure that you're not just designing your Gen AI products correctly, but also running them and making sure they're running the same way. What's, I think, missing that conversation, or at least not getting enough attention right now, is the cost of running those evals, because those evals actually tend to be Gen AI calls themselves, and very often can be as much or more expensive to run those evals than the cost of the Gen AI application itself. And I think as more organizations and enterprises start running evals at scale, they'll, I think, catch up to that reality that there's a cost there that needs to be factored in because it has value.
Yeah.
But you have to factor that in the beginning so that you're not surprised when you kind of go to run those.
Yeah, it's a great point. I have a couple of rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Agentic or generative AI, which do you instinctively trust more?
I would say generative AI, partly because, or mostly because, since you're asking about trust, it's easier to verify those outputs.
Yeah.
Right? You have a certain output that you come and you can sometimes ask the LLM to check itself. You can go yourself and look up different sources to try and make sure that it's correct. I think with the agentic, you can do it, but that is a little harder because it's a multi-stage process, and so verification takes a lot more effort, a lot more time in terms of how you do it.
Yeah. What's the best compliment someone can give your product?
So I'll say this in two different ways. One way it doesn't quite capture in text, but it's like the chef's kiss.
Yeah.
Someone telling you that it had that feeling for them. I think the written version of that would be a user saying it felt like magic.
Yes.
Right? And saying, oh wow, I didn't know how it works, but it felt like magic.
Yeah.
And I think, to me personally, I think that's what I kind of live for. That's what keeps me going.
That's the win, right?
That's the win. Right?
Yeah. What's one bold prediction you have for the future of tech that you're willing to bet on today?
This is a tough one. I guess if I had to try to think of something that's beyond, I think, the realm of what we see. I think we see a lot of our interactions with AI changing from, the written form to let's say, voice
Yeah.
and so on. So in terms of something, if I try to extrapolate that out in the future, and I think of, some place beyond where I would naturally normally think, I think one thing we'll see is software becoming invisible.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that we've spent, I don't know, maybe 20, 30, 40 years or more, right? Teaching users to use products in a certain way. We click on this button, you choose this menu option, you fill out this form, and they all involve, or say this as a written prompt or a spoken prompt, but they all involve training users to use software in a certain way. And I think when I say software becomes invisible, what I mean is that, imagine a world where you have some type of personal, agent assistant that is interacting with you always, interacting with you in whatever way is most useful in that context. It might be voice, it might be some type of hand or, let's say, facial indication, but different forms of interaction where the agent is translating what you want into the goal and the outcome you want to achieve, and potentially spinning up the required interface if further interaction is required. That's kind of ephemeral, where it kind of spins up maybe a UI and says, oh, enter something here, right? Or do this, or select something here. And then those things go away, and you're just interacting with an assistant that is kind of continuously interacting with you and then taking the actions on your behalf to achieve the outcome that you need.
Awesome. Yeah, like a Jarvis kind of.
Kind of like exactly like a kind of Jarvis kind of interface where there is software there in the end, but we don't see it.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Thank you again so much for coming by for this conversation. Really appreciate it. I think our audience will like it too.
I enjoyed being here as well. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Brave Technologist podcast. To never miss an episode, make sure you hit follow in your podcast app. If you haven't already made the switch to the Brave browser, you can download it for free today at brave.com and start using Brave Search, which enables you to search the web privately. Brave also shields you from the ads, trackers, and other creepy stuff following you across the web.